Good afternoon, and welcome to the second webinar in our Psychology of Negotiation series. Today, we will be looking at the art of communicating effectively in conflicts. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping points. Firstly, you may have noticed the Ask a Question tab on your screens. It can be used to post questions or give us feedback on any aspect of the webinar. We will aim to answer the questions at the end of the webinar. If, however, we unfortunately do not manage to get to your question, or you are listening to a recording of this webinar, we would be happy to address any queries after the webinar by phone or email. Our contact details will appear on a later slide. As I mentioned, this is the second webinar in our series focusing on the psychology of negotiation, part of a wider series of webinars from our commercial litigation team. The next webinar in this series will take place on Wednesday, 4th of March, and will focus on bridging the cultural divide in conflicts and negotiation.
How we choose to communicate influences the impact of our message. Take the words on this slide as an example. A sinister message perhaps, but what impact does it have on you? If you don't have a wife, probably very little. Even if you do have a wife, I doubt that it engages you much. But what if it was written like this? You'd be forgiven for thinking that I had something to hide if I pleaded my innocence to you in this way. The bold text and capital letters have a sensory impact on the reader which, in modern society, is thought to be comparable to shouting. The impact is very different if I change the format of the text. Maybe you now think that my use of emoticons makes my crime even more sinister. However, removing the bold text, writing in lowercase, and including smiley face emoticons inevitably causes the reader to digest the same text in a much softer tone. You may rarely choose to use such emphasis when communicating, but again, it is evident and interesting that we can so easily adjust the tone of the way we communicate without even changing any of the words in a sentence. Subtle changes can even change the meaning of the sentence quite drastically. For example, let's play with the emphasis in the sentence and see what it does. Let's start with the stressing of the first word. For example, I didn't kill your wife. The meaning suddenly suggests that someone else did, and I know who. I didn't kill your wife. Now it's a protest of innocence, and I'm saying that I don't know anything about it. I didn't kill your wife, but the sentence now suggests that I mugged her or something similar. I didn't kill your wife might suggest that I killed someone else's. And I didn't kill your wife perhaps suggests that your brother might not be in good health. What we can see from our particularly violent example is that a simple sentence can have 5 meanings, depending upon the emphasis in it. If I'm reading the sentence to you, I'm in control of exactly how I stress the words. I can also communicate other information in all sorts of ways. I didn't kill your wife in a sort of crying voice, or I didn't kill your wife in a sort of laughing voice. But if you're reading the message, it's much harder for me to impart additional information.
And that is exactly what we would like to talk to you about today. The importance and some of the ingredients of communication and how you can strive to communicate effectively. We are going to look at a number of psychological studies which will highlight hidden facets of communication. You may not have previously been aware of them, or at least not consciously so. And we will look at some of the challenges that modern technology has introduced into effective communication. Whilst our intention is for this webinar to be focused towards negotiation and conflict scenarios, much of what we will talk about will be applicable to our everyday interactions. We are firstly going to look at non-verbal communications, or to put it another way, the elements of communication beyond the words we speak. Within this, we will look at a number of psychological theories, such as the halo effect or mirroring. We will then look at the use of nonverbals in written communication. After that, we will move on to look at the important role trust plays in effective communication, before finally we will look at the psychological theory of priming and how priming can be used to influence the impact of our communication. But first, let's start with who we are and why we are here talking to you today. I am Ben Pilbrow. a partner in the Commercial Disputes and Regulation team here at Shepperton and Wedderburn.
And I'm Andrew Connelly, a trainee in the Commercial Disputes and Regulation team.
As dispute lawyers, our team is regularly involved in advising and supporting clients involved in conflict situations. Communication in conflict scenarios comes in many forms: communicating with a client, advocacy in the courtroom, negotiation with our clients and with their opposition, mediations, and so on. Effective communication, therefore, is of particular importance to us, especially in a day and age where clients expect us to be as efficient as possible and are eager to keep costs down. If we can achieve our end goal from one telephone call as opposed to 5 emails, we need to be able to recognize that the most effective way, or perhaps efficient way, for us to communicate in this situation is by telephone. However, sometimes it is better to incur the costs of 5 emails if email is the best medium for the message.
Advances in technology have driven changes in how we communicate. It may feel like we live in a world where we solely communicate with each other through technology. Just think about travelling on public transport. Think about the communication with strangers that we all desperately try to avoid by staring at our phones. Even so, the statistics suggest that in the business world, face-to-face communication is still fairly prevalent. On any given day, there are approximately 11 million meetings taking place in the United States. If you multiply that by the number of business days in a year, approximately 260, that gives you a total of 2.86 billion meetings a year. Letters may have been recently eclipsed by emails, but nevertheless, in 2018, Royal Mail still delivered approximately 14.4 billion letters. This equates to about 220 letters per person in the UK every year. Whilst these figures may sound high, they do not compare to how much we communicate through technology. Ofcom have reported that in the year 2017-18, the UK made a total of 148.6 billion minutes of mobile calls and an additional 54 billion minutes of landline calls. Unsurprisingly, email statistics are by far the highest. In 2018, 281 billion emails were sent and received on average every day. Of these, 124 billion were business emails, which apparently works out at the average office worker sending and receiving 120 emails every day. In the early 2000s, the total number of emails sent and received each day was significantly lower at 12 billion. Clearly, the way we communicate has developed with technology. The challenge, therefore, is to ensure that our approach to communicating develops alongside technology.
One of the most, if not the most, important aspects of communication is non-verbal communication. If you look at this picture on the slide, can you understand what's going on? Well, to me, it is clearly a display of dominance and submission. And the fact that we can all recognize from this photograph, without studying the interaction further, indicates that non-verbals are a powerful element of communication. They are so important that Professor Albert Mehrabian believed that only 7% of communication is attributable to the words we speak. He suggested 38% comes from the way the words are spoken, which is known as paralanguage, and a whopping 55% comes from other non-verbals such as body language. How can we use this, say, in negotiation? Well, negotiation is about communication. To negotiate, you need to, firstly, express what you want. Secondly, understand what your counterparty wants. And thirdly, persuade them to agree with you. All of this can only be done by communication. Hence, the better you can communicate, the better you will be at negotiation. Given the importance of nonverbals in communication, I think it's important that we understand the different categories of nonverbals. There are probably more than you would have guessed, and a lot of them have sciencey names that mean they sound like they're a lot more sophisticated than they actually are. If I break them down, I expect that they will all be wholly recognizable for you. So let's start with kinesics, often called body language. These range from gestures that are directly translatable into a word or phrase. For example, when you give someone the middle finger. through to movements that accompany or reinforce verbal messages, like when I tap my finger to draw attention to what I am saying now, or displays of emotion, for example, snarling or frowning, and finally movements that release physical or emotional tension. If I cracked my knuckles, you might dislike the sound, but in certain circumstances, it would be clear what I was saying without words. Next, there's proscenics, the information that we obtain from distances and space. I suspect that you rarely consider how much information we send and receive from people's relationship through space. However, I'm sure we all recognize the emotions that we feel when somebody invades our personal space. They can be very strong, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, given that our proximity to strangers can be an issue of safety. The strength of that emotion produces very strong signals, and like all of the matters that we are reviewing today, can be manipulated. How about paralanguage, the non-lexical component of communication by speech? For example, intonation, pitch, and the speed of speaking, or hesitation noises. It's not what you say, it's the way that you say it. Interestingly, more so than kinesics, paralanguage differs by language and culture, as it is more learned than innate. Then we have posture, eye contact, facial expressions, touch or haptics as it's sometimes known, and silence, which should all be self-explanatory. Those are just the forms of nonverbal communication by the body. There is a whole further raft of communication from the settings. Of the three identified on the slide, perhaps the most important for the purposes of a negotiation, I think, is environmental cues, where and when you carry out a negotiation can have a strong influence on its outcome.
Now that we understand how important nonverbals are in communication, we need to understand how we can use these nonverbals to our advantage in a negotiation or conflict situation. Ben has just been talking about how nonverbals, such as hand gestures, can be used to influence others. We may use certain hand gestures to display a certain emotion. What we may tend to forget is that we ourselves can be influenced by our own nonverbals. This theory was researched by Amy Cuddy and Dana Carney, psychologists at Harvard and Berkeley. Their general field of research was dominance, focusing on how people express and react to nonverbal dominance signals. In 2010, they investigated whether people's own nonverbal dominance signals govern how they think and feel about themselves. Previous research had found that nonverbals did have an effect on how we think and feel generally. For example, we will smile when we are feeling happy, but when we are forced to smile, say by holding a pen sideways between our teeth, it makes us feel happy too. Amy Cuddy and Dana Carney wanted to take this further and investigate whether the connection between nonverbals and behaviour was equally two-way in respect of dominance, i.e., when you feel powerful, you're more likely to act powerfully. But is it also possible that when you pretend to be powerful, you're more likely to actually feel powerful? To do this, they had to first look at what is meant by being powerful. Powerful people tend to be more assertive, more confident, and more optimistic. They're the kind of people that think they are likely to win a game of chance, so they take more risks. Clearly, a powerful person differs from a powerless person. Physiologically, there are differences too. Testosterone is known as the dominance hormone, and cortisol is known as the stress hormone. What you find is that high-power alpha males in primate hierarchies have high testosterone and low cortisol, and powerful and effective leaders also have high testosterone and low cortisol. If an individual becomes a leader suddenly, and you then test his hormone levels, you'll find that within a few days that individual's testosterone has gone up significantly and his cortisol has dropped significantly. What Amy Cuddy and Dana Carney found was exactly that. When an individual puts himself into a high power pose, the experiment involved them doing so for a few minutes, they are more likely to display the characteristics of dominance. And what is meant by a high power pose? Well, it's much like the image on the top left of the slide, opening up our body and making ourselves bigger. mimicking how we would expect a dominant person to carry themselves. Contrast this with the bottom left image, which we would call a low power pose, making ourselves as small as possible and trying to shut ourselves off from those around us. Amy Cuddy and Dana Carney found that when people are in high power pose condition, 86% of them will gamble, thus showing the risk tolerance that we see in dominant individuals. Contrastingly, when people are in a low power pose condition, only 60% of them will gamble, a significant difference. Similar results were found when looking at the participants' physiology. The testosterone levels of those individuals in the high power pose condition increased by about 20%, whereas the low power pose individuals experienced a decrease of about 10%. On cortisol, the high power people experienced a 25% decrease, and the low power people experienced a 15% increase. Clearly, they had found a significant difference, a difference both on physiology and behaviour. They decided to take their experiment further and look at whether there was any outward effect. They ran a similar experiment in conjunction with a job interview, a generally high stress scenario. They asked their participants to carry out a high or low power pose again for 2 minutes, and then put them through a stressful job interview which they recorded. They then got external examiners who were blind to the hypothesis, blind to the conditions, and had no idea who had been posing in what way. They were asked to choose who they would hire. Who did they choose? You guessed it. To a significant degree, they chose the high power poses. So how is this relevant to negotiations and conflicts? As we have already said, the ability to negotiate well and resolve conflicts stems from our ability to communicate effectively. Communicating effectively means using the tools we have at our disposal in an efficient way. If faking it till you make it makes you approach negotiations in a more confident manner, maybe it's worth giving it a try.
Another theory involving nonverbal communication is known as the halo effect theory. Put simply, the halo effect is the tendency for our impressions of a person in one area to influence our opinion of that person in another area. This theory was first researched and developed by the American psychologist Edward Thorndike. Thorndike's study involved military officers ranking their subordinates. They were asked to rank them based on character traits such as leadership ability and intelligence. But importantly, they did so without ever having spoken to the subordinates. After studying the answers given by the military officers, Thorndike noticed a correlation between unrelated positive and negative traits. The subordinates who were taller and generally regarded as more attractive were also rated as more intelligent and with better leadership potential, apparently for no other reason than the way they looked. Thorndike's conclusion was that, contrary to logic, people generalize from one outstanding trait to form a favourable view, or an unfavourable view, of a person's entire personality. Now, clearly non-verbal cues speak to us in many ways. What we saw with the fake it till you make it theory was that when we can use non-verbals to our advantage. What the halo effect theory suggests is that non-verbals can also be a hindrance and cause us to draw irrational conclusions about people with whom we are communicating. Unless you happen to be a tall, dark and handsome person, then you might think the halo effect theory is an undisputed phenomenon that should be accepted by all. It might seem that we are now straying somewhat away from the art of communicating effectively in conflicts, but the point is that there is a whole world of communication going on beyond what we say, which will be impacting how we communicate with one another without us even knowing it. Having an understanding of all the aspects of communication will inevitably allow us to make the most of our interactions. Take, for example, mirroring. Mirroring is the hypothesis that we are unconsciously copy what someone else is doing while communicating with them. It can range from people exhibiting similar body language or gestures or voice tonalities. Research into the theory of mirroring has suggested that the mirroring of behavior can increase rapport, likability, and generate positive feeling between two people. For example, mirroring was investigated by Dr. Giacomo Rizzolatti of the University of Parma. His study concerned the behavior and neurology of macaque monkeys. Through his research, he realized that the monkey's innate sense of imitation was linked to specific brain neurons. Frequently, when studying the monkeys, he would see that one monkey did something like pick up an object. A monkey who observed this would then experience activation in the same part of the brain. Not only did he observe brain neurons acting in the same way, but frequently the monkeys would physically mirror what they had just seen. This is an interesting hypothesis. It underlines the fact that there is a physiological link between what we see, how we feel, and how we act. Think of a day-to-day example. When someone smiles at us, our natural reaction is to smile back. We might think that we do so because we're consciously being polite. But at a subconscious level, perhaps, when we saw the other person smile, neurons in our brain automatically prepared us for smiling back. And so it was, in fact, an innate reaction. Mirroring is not just limited to face-to-face interactions. Whilst mirroring the accent of the person you are speaking to might not lead to effective communication, given that it might be misinterpreted as mockery, mirroring the tone of their voice is most certainly going to help build rapport. Similarly, with written communication, if I wrote you a "Dear Mr. Connelly" letter, I'd probably be slightly taken aback to receive a "Yo, what's up, Ben?" response. In a negotiation or conflict situation, building rapport and striking up some kind of relationship with the other party is likely to lead to a more cooperative communication and therefore a more favourable result. An awareness of the theory of mirroring may therefore be a useful tool.
The final aspect of non-verbal communication that we are going to touch upon today is something we looked at the start of the webinar: non-verbals in written communication. We've just spent a long time telling you about how communication is so much more than the words we speak. It's our body language, tone of voice, and so on. In written communication, we lose the majority of this. But if non-verbals are so influential, does that not make written communication a much less effective method of communicating? Possibly, but it has other strengths that are just undeniable. We can probably all think of a time when we have sat pondering the intended tone of an email. The British Protocol for Indirect Communication makes this a particular problem in these shores. Bereft of additional non-verbal pointers, should I take this message at face value, or is something else intended? Despite this, there are a number of elements of written communication which partially compensate for missing non-verbals. Punctuation is the most widely used example. An exclamation mark is a written non-verbal cue. However, even an exclamation mark is open to differing interpretations, which may be why their use is discouraged in a business setting. Adding emphasis by writing in bold text or underlining is something you're more likely to see in business communication, but this is unlikely to help diffuse a conflict situation. In fact, it will probably make things worse. The insinuation is likely to be that this is something that the reader should already have been aware of, and so they should pay more attention in the future. Emoticons are even more explicit simulations of nonverbals, although again their use is rare in a business setting. Interestingly, a recent study found that the use of emoticons actually speeds up communication, as they allow for fewer words to be used and can assist with interpreting tone. Pretty effective then. Whilst we are not for a second suggesting that you should start using emoticons or emojis in business emails, it's interesting to see that written communication can be at its most effective when it mimics non-verbal cues that are present in face-to-face communication. For example, a smile being a smiley face emoji. Another easy method for harnessing non-verbals in written communication is simply pictures of our faces. Researchers have found that the persuasiveness or trustworthiness of a written message is increased when that message is accompanied by a picture. Take this real-life example. A car valeting firm included a picture of the person who'd be cleaning the vehicle in the confirmation email sent after booking. What they found was that the number of customers who cancelled or failed to be home when the company came to clean the car dropped dramatically. It is a lot easier to ignore a faceless email than one with a face attached to it. What is the explanation for this? Psychologists have found that when we are exposed to arguments based solely on facts and logic, it's easier to be skeptical and dismissive of what's being said. But when a message is humanized, the information is processed differently. A kind of personal connection is created with the sender. Finally, a great example of the importance of nonverbals is the fairly recent addition Facebook implemented to their status updates. In addition to writing the words in the status box, you're now able to add a prompt such as, "Andrew is feeling ecstatic." Clearly, Facebook feels that the words alone are not enough for us to understand the tone of our communications. It's pretty ironic, however, that the current state of its technology requires more words to remedy that failing. However, perhaps this is the direction of travel. There are now numerous platforms whose stated aim is to replace the dominance of emails. In many ways, this push is to address the clear limitations of emails, such as the duplication of data they inevitably generate. But we also think that the evolution will address the non-verbal failings of emails. How will be interesting to see, given the logical requirement to make the non-verbals largely subconscious, as they are with face-to-face interactions. What we can conclude from all this is that non-verbals are clearly an essential aspect of effective face-to-face communication, and are perhaps the biggest limitation facing digital communication.
The next thing we would like to talk to you about is trust. It will not surprise you to hear that research has suggested that our most positive and cooperative interactions are with those people with whom we have a more trusting relationship. We mentioned earlier the very British anxiety one feels on public transport. The thought of having to communicate with strangers during the morning rush hour is enough to make some people never want to leave their house. It is human nature that we prefer to communicate with people that we know and like. The power of trust in communication has been the subject of numerous studies. A recent study involved participants under the illusion that they were playing an economic investment game with 3 different players: a close friend, a stranger, or a computerized slot machine. In reality, each participant was actually playing the investment game with a computer powered by an algorithm which caused it to display actions worthy of trust 50% of the time. To be successful in the game, the participants had to make a judgment call as to whether they should co-invest with the person they were playing with, or whether they should be cautious and withhold their money. If they invested 50% of the time, an investment would pay off, and 50% of the time they would lose their money. Interestingly, the results of the study found that those players who were told that they were playing the game with a close friend reported that, firstly, they found playing the game with a friend to be more enjoyable, and secondly, they were more likely to invest with a close friend as a result. The difficulty we are faced with in a negotiation or conflict situation is that there is a high chance that the person we are dealing with does not trust us, or vice versa. So, how do we overcome this? Mastering non-verbals might be a good place to start. Non-verbals are more persuasive than verbals, precisely because they are harder consciously to simulate. They are therefore more influential. The most recent example I experienced of this was my 6-year-old daughter thanking my stepmother for a present when she preferred the presents her younger brothers received. She managed to say thank you, but the tears streaming down her face told a different, more powerful story. However, I think she was saved because of the love and trust my stepmother has for her, and obviously because she's 6 years old. More usually, we are exposed to such a disconnect between nonverbal cues and verbal language. We will immediately lose trust in what the person is saying. Having control of our nonverbals, therefore, may allow us to appear more trustworthy. Building trust solely through written communication is a hard task. If that is your objective, think how to appropriate as many of the nonverbal cues as are available to you.
The next thing we'd like to talk to you about is priming. Before we explain what priming is, we'd like to carry out a short experiment. Please look at the words on the slide and read out the colours of each word. Not the word itself, just the colour. It may help to actually read them out loud. Once you've done so, just take a mental note of how long it took you. Now please do the exact same thing with this slide, reading out only the colours, not the word itself. And again, make a mental note of how long it took you. Hopefully you found the second slide more difficult, and it therefore took you longer to read out the colours. I know it certainly worked for me. This is an example of priming. Priming is an implicit memory effect in which exposure to one stimulus influences the response to another stimulus. The reason you found it harder to read out the colours on the second slide was that you were primed to read the words, as these were colours themselves. The words were used to try and influence you to make a mistake on what is really a very simple task, identifying colours. Whilst this is a very simple example, it shows how we are able to influence the way people think or behave. A famous example of the impact of priming on written communication is from a 1974 study by American professors Loftus and Palmer. Their sample consisted of 45 students who were divided into 5 groups of 9. All of the participants watched a video of a car crash and were then asked a specific question about the speed of the cars. Loftus and Palmer manipulated the verb used in the question. For example, how fast were the cars going when they smashed, collided, bumped, hit, or contacted with each other? They found that the estimated speed was affected by the verb used. For example, participants who were given the verb smashed reported an average speed of 40.5 miles per hour, whereas participants who were given the word contacted reported an average speed of 31.8 miles per hour, a significant difference. In a second experiment, Loftus and Palmer used a different sample of 150 students who were divided into 3 even groups. All of the students watched a 1-minute video depicting a car accident and were then given a questionnaire to complete. One group was asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Another group was asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? The final control group was not asked about the speed of the vehicles. 1 week later, the participants returned and were asked a series of questions about the accident. The critical question was, did you see any broken glass? 32% of the participants who were previously questioned using the verb smashed reported seeing broken glass. 14% of the participants who were previously questioned using the verb hit reported seeing broken glass, and only 12% of the control group reported seeing broken glass. In reality, there was no broken glass. This ability to manipulate and influence the way people think and act is quite astonishing and highlights the power of priming.
That just about concludes today's webinar. We hope you found it interesting. Clearly, there are far more subconscious elements of communication than conscious ones. Trying consciously to master every element of what we have discussed may cause you to have a meltdown in negotiation, but we hope that we have identified some techniques to harness them. Being aware of the importance of nonverbals and the benefits of building trust can be priceless tools in negotiations. As I mentioned at the start, if you have any questions, you can ask them now by clicking on the Ask a Question tab. Or we can answer them later. We've got one now. Are you advocating that people should fake mirroring as part of the negotiating strategy? If so, are there not risks to this approach? If not, are you more suggesting that we should be conscious of our own behavior, tone, language, and what it might be saying? Well, thank you, Malcolm, for that question. Personally, no, I'm not. Both on the mirroring and on the fake it till you make it approach. My belief is that consciously trying to harness your non-verbals is something that, unless you're an actor worthy of an Oscar, people just can't do. And in fact, saying an actor worthy of an Oscar is probably the wrong suggestion. Personally, I think that the best way to harness these types of techniques is by trying to engage with your own state of mind. So, for example, if you want to try and show confidence, then you have to, like an actor, get into a role of being confident. whether that's by doing a power pose or whether that is some other technique. I think there's various sports psychologists who talk about imagining the end goal, etc. Those are all effectively trying to use the same subconscious pathways. And for me, it's the same with mirroring. If you tried to consciously mirror another person, I think it would come across as fake. But if you try and do so subconsciously, I think it's something that that can have an impact. And I think that's the only question we've had. So hopefully we'll get some more questions by email. You've got our email addresses, or by phone. You can call us. We hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening. Last thing before we go, as we previously mentioned, our next webinar is taking place on the 4th of March, and it's focusing on bridging the cultural divide. It's not one to miss.